Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Perspective. We know that there's of course a conference going to be held in Doha, and we are looking at of course the Prime Minister's visit to Qatar on September 15th. We'll be talking about of course the effects as we see of this conference, and as far as of course the attack in Qatar that we've seen, and how the Islamic community, the Islamic countries, how they react, the options at this time for the world, and of course as far as these strikes are concerned, what kind of a future do we envisage for the Middle East as we see Israel crossing the red line, or even as we speak, the kind of attack that has happened, the strikes that have happened do show that how Israel is also in a sense becoming a rogue state. All of that today on Perspective. I have with me Ahmed Awan, who's a foreign policy expert. Thank you for being with us today. We also have with us Dr. Salma Malik, who's a foreign affairs expert, Dr. Adnan Sarwar, who's also a foreign expert. I'm going to start with Ahmed here. Ahmed, we were speaking about this. We know that this is of course as far as Islamic countries are concerned, this conference of course is a huge step forward in the countries, and the fact that this summit will of course determine how things proceed from here. In terms of the options at this time, in terms of alliances at this time, how are you looking at, what kind of a picture are you looking at?
I think this summit is very significant in the sense that it comes after Israel's attacks on the Doha, on the Qatari capital, and the fact that the attack itself was an attempt to sabotage peace, the peace process that was sponsored, also backed by the US itself, speaks volumes of the intentions of the Israeli government. They are not just committing a genocide in Palestine, they are also undermining international norms, international rules, which have in a way made an international system stable for the last at least 200 to 300 years. So in that context, they're challenging every norm that exists in the book. So in that context, the summit is significant because it sort of again implies that the Muslim countries cannot once again rely on any other actor apart from their own bloc to unify and to seek some kind of a solution or any kind of a stance which will prevent this new Israeli normal. The fact that they did not just attack Doha, they attacked almost 6 countries within 48 hours during that time period. So it sort of shows how rogue Israel has gone, and we keep on talking about how the US should rein in Israeli actions, but so far even President Trump and its administration seem to be failing on that. So I think there has to be a unified stance taken by the Muslim bloc through this summit. There has to be a clear message that this will not be tolerated, and in fact so much so that I will go to the extent that there has to be some kind of symbolic military response to this action. Otherwise this emboldened behavior of Israel will continue to happen and will not stop here. One more thing, sorry, sure.
Let me include Dr. Salma and then I'll come back to you. Dr. Salma, can you hear me? Dr. Salma, what something that Ahmed just said, he said that if we want we want there to be a sufficient deterrence effect to what's happened as far as Qatar is concerned. Of course, we're looking the strikes that we've seen. We're going to have the Islamic countries are going to have some kind of a strong reaction. Do you agree with this? We are also talking about options at this time, which have to be seen, the kind of options that are available in the context of, of course, economically also, militarily also. How do you see things?
Right. Thank you so much, Mahrukh. I absolutely agree with Ahmed when he says that the Muslim countries have to find a solution amongst themselves rather than rely on external actors. Because at the end of the day, the external actors in the picture, primarily the USA and even some of the Western powers, but the US is the most important, effective, and the grand actor in this picture, which is calling the shots, or through which Israel is calling the shots. So one cannot really decipher both of them from one another, who is relying more on the other side. Although this is very clear that Israel is a very defiant actor. Israel refuses to listen to any voice of reason, even if it is coming from Trump's USA or Washington DC in any capacity. Even informing the United States prior to attacking Qatar, which was hardly any response time. And we also have examples in the past where the US has admonished Israel from taking unilateral actions or giving them a very short notice, but they keep on doing these things over and over again. So they're upping the ante of how these countries, what is their tolerance threshold and what's their tolerance level. Having said that, when we look at the Islamic countries, the diplomatic counteroffensive that Qatar has initiated, it is commendable, it is very good. It needs to be appreciated, it needs to be given complete all these countries need to stand with Qatar in this particular scenario, because it's the fight for survival now for the Muslim countries. What we need to understand is that if it's Qatar today, which was trying to broker peace between these countries, and Israel was very much aware of that, and Israel was completely in picture, then tomorrow it can be any other country. The kind of diplomatic offensive the Israeli envoy in the UN tried to outplay with the Pakistani envoy is also a point to note, where they're trying to give very strange signals to countries which are not listening to them, which are not part of the deal, and which are not really standing up to what Israeli situation is all about, how they have done it in Palestine. So we really need to keep this thing in mind, that if we do not stick together, if we do not find a common solution, tomorrow that precision surgical strike, quote unquote, can happen in our homeland as well, in any other country.
Let me include Let me include Dr. Adnan Sarwar. I'll come back to you. Gee, Dr. Adnan, can you hear me? Dr. Adnan? Okay. Ahmed, you heard what Dr. Salma is saying. She's talking about how, we need to have, and you also of course said that there has to be a red line now for Israel, the way that it's blatantly ignoring international law, international norms, it's coming to different kind of threats, wheeled or unwheeled. We're also looking at that, as Salma mentioned. But as far as Israel's repeated violations of international law, do you think there's going to be some sort of a reaction from, of course, United Nations, from the Security Council also overall, what kind of whether that has effects or not, we have to see those things happen, right?
Yes. In terms of the response from the UN or the West, if you look at the recent Security Council statement as well, they passed and condemned the attacks on Doha without naming Israel. So that itself speaks volumes of the kind of diplomatic leverage Israel still enjoys, thanks to the US actually. So in my view, the options in terms of legal options, yes, we've seen in terms of the last 2 years, Netanyahu is a wanted criminal, war criminal by the ICC. There have also been indictments in the ICJ. But they continue to violate, and they doesn't seem to have any effect on their actions, because as long as there is no accountability or consequence for Israeli actions, these actions will continue. There is also a lesson from Muslim countries, especially the Arab countries in the region, who have actually signed or are in favor of normalizing relations with Israel. This is a test case for them as well, because it is through those understandings that they have with Israel that allowed using their airspace, whether it was attacks against Iran or attacks against Yemen. So they have to reconsider and shut down those airspaces that they have given those space to the Israeli government and their military. So there has to be a strong collective response from these governments. Otherwise, we've seen that in the idea that going soft on Israel might make them more amicable, more normalized, or lead towards a peace in the Middle East is something of a mythical idea now, because it is only making Israel more rogue in its behavior, more aggressive. And in a way, if you look at the greater picture, the Muslim countries from Pakistan to Turkey are being sandwiched between two extremist regimes. One is on the Hindutva ideology and one is on the Zionist ideology, and they are implicitly backed by the US as well and other Western powers. So it has to be a response from within the Muslim bloc. Other than that, I don't see the
also,
options.
you know, like we were earlier saying, there's also, of course, you know, some intel, or there's some information that what happened was not, you know, the knowledge as far as the US is concerned was perhaps last minute as far as these strikes are concerned. So in that sense, do you think that perhaps there will be a stronger reaction from the US, or do you think that, and you know, what we've seen since is, of course, you know, doesn't really make us believe that that will happen. So do you think that there are any chances that perhaps the US will react strongly to what is now, become unquestionably, terrorism at the hands of Israel, and it's increasing territorially also?
I think, to be honest, US foreign policy is, in summary, a scenario where the friends of US are not friends with each other, especially when it comes to the Middle East. So I think in that context, the US itself faces a lot of dilemmas, not just in terms of, you know, who to back and who not to back in the Middle East, but overall, if you look at their foreign policy the last 20-30 years since the end of the Cold War, they have been on one side advocating human rights and intervention in the name of human rights, and on the other hand they have been backing countries like Israel who are committing state terrorism and committing genocidal activities. So it is difficult to gauge what kind of response and to what extent we can rely on the US responses, even though it's been almost a week now. The US response has so far been mild, in my opinion. Even today, Secretary Rubio is visiting Israel and has acknowledged Israel's right of defense and its security concerns are valid. So it's the same repetitive narrative that we've been seeing for the last 2.5 years, especially since October 7th. So I don't expect much from it, because the reason being that Israel has such a strong influential lobbies working in the US administration, which constrain independent foreign policy even for the US president actually. So there are a lot of constraints domestically as well within the US which prevent, even if, you know, we often talk about President Trump being unorthodox.
So you're saying that it's not that the US may not want to do something, but that it also has limited options. Is
yes,
that true?
it does, because like I said,
they have their own alliances, and they have their own commitments. Let me go to Salma with this. Dr. Salma, do you agree that even if the US would want to, you know, ask Israel to take a step back, its hands are, you know, it has its limitations? Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. Number one, the limitations that Ahmed is pointing out, those are certainly there, but also the fact that Israel is very defined when it comes to anything. It has an end goal, and it is leaving no stones unturned to fulfill those end goals, however ideal those end goals may be. And somewhere in a latent memory or in those archives, those interests that Israel has, that they converge with what the US is doing, or the US interests in the Middle East converge with Israel is doing. So there's a convergence when it comes to that, and Israel does the bad cop strategy. It is doing whatever it is doing, but we also need to remember that it was this president in his previous tenure who actually opened the Pandora's box much more further than what it was, and they have totally reshaped the dynamics of Middle East, as well as through the Abraham Accords and declaring Jerusalem as the capital, and so many other factors that went with it. So they have actually changed the political map of this area to a larger extent. Another aspect that is very important that we need to notice, that any of these countries which are neighboring Israel and are allies with the United States, Ahmed is very right in pinpointing that they are not friends with one another, they are friends with the US, and that is how the divide and rule policy of colonials or neo-colonials or neo-imperialists appears to be. But we also need to keep in mind that any of the military equipment that these countries have, they are totally networked with what America is providing them. And if America is providing them, then Israel has complete access to all the data and information that is happening. This is the type of ingress Israel enjoys.
Options. Then what are the options that the Islamic countries, as they meet, are before them, in your opinion? I think Ahmed was earlier talking about the oil embargo, I believe, and that perhaps there is that it had certain results. What road or what direction do you think they can take in this instance now?
Number one, I'm a bit pessimistic because unfortunately the Muslim countries, whenever they meet, it's more of a symbolic meeting and they don't really agree with a joint action. But even if they do agree with a joint action, I really don't think that there would be much of a kinetic approach taken. There would be an economic embargo or the sanctions, the oil embargo that Ahmed has also pointed out towards. That can be a wonderful way of making these countries understand the silent power the Muslim countries enjoy. But since 1974, the main oil embargo that was imposed, the US has made it sure that these countries remain so divided and so dependent on the US expediency that they will never be able to come together and impose a unified embargo. They can also indulge in collective diplomacy, float a resolution in the United Nations Security Council, not only GA, but also in the Security Council, carry out necessary actions. If nothing else, at least they can together go for declaring this into a genocide. They can declare this, what is happening in Palestine, into a war crime and several other things. They have even failed to do that. So this is the weakness which the Israeli side is always exploiting when it comes to the Middle Eastern politics. So I think this is a moment. If the Muslim world loses this moment, this is kind of a warning bell that has been hung by the Israelis, that we can do this to Qatar, we can do this to you as well. So unless and until these Muslim countries, now when they meet in Qatar, they come up with a united, actionable plan of action. Not something which is heavy on words, but something which is very strong on action. This problem
matter. Right, fair enough. Ahmed, do you agree with what Dr. Salma is saying? Of course, there has to be some kind of a reaction, but then of course it has to be within the realm of options. And when we look at, for example, Abraham Accords, do you think that, what is the future of Abraham Accords in your opinion?
Yes, definitely. I completely agree with Dr. Salma about the future of the Muslim security in general. The fact that this summit is very, very essential to what is to come next. I mean, we've seen what has happened so far, but this summit will dictate or set the trend, the tone for what is to expect in the coming months and years. I think as a whole, like you mentioned, kinetic action may not be a reality or may not be a possibility that Muslim countries will be looking at, because it might have the cost may be too high for the Israeli, the Muslim countries to bear for that. At the same time, in the recent conflicts between Iran, Israel, and then we saw the, I mean, I would call symbolic strikes on by Iran on Qatari soil on the US airbase, were also examples of, if there is any kind of backdoor diplomacy happening, we can expect some kind of symbolic response in that way with mutual understanding. But at the same time, realistically speaking, there has to be a creation of an OIC, economic sovereign wealth fund, where ensuring that no Muslim money or investment is being going to Israeli companies. This is for a start, if not the oil embargo. At the same time, in terms of energy leverage that the Arab countries have, there are also options that they can look towards China and Russia now, because that is one area that really pinches the US foreign policy as we speak, because we've seen how India was treated by America because of its purchase of the Russian oil. So these are areas where the Arab countries can come together if they have the ability to actually unify and take such stance. There are options. There is. I'm not saying their options are limited. Options are there, but it is up to the political will of these countries to take these actions to ensure that no such actions will be tolerated, and this should be made an example of this, because this is not the first time Israel has done something like that, and it's the objectives of Israel are not going to stop here, because in my view they are following a very religious extremist ideology, which is Zionism,
but
the idea of a better Israel.
That's also true, but are they, in your opinion, becoming a rogue state? If
they have become a rogue state, actually.
So do you think that the US will now have to take some steps to curtail their actions at this point, whether they do so publicly or they do so not so publicly, or if they choose to do so privately, if we talk about Donald Trump, because all those hopes that of course we had earlier when he came into power, or of course there was, it doesn't seem to have translated the way that some people thought.
See, even if there is any kind of a response or any kind of pressure from the US on the Israeli government, in my view, that pressure will be very short term. It will not be a long term solution to this problem, which is chronic to the region. So we've seen instances where US has put pressures on Israel, but it has only yielded in short term results. It has not entirely stopped Israel from a radical change in its approach towards the Muslim countries. In fact, I believe that the Abrahamic Accords is being seen by Israel as a weakness of the Arab countries. And they're seeing it, I will sort of go and dwell into history, by the way.
Right.
The appeasement policy that was used by the British and the French to appease Hitler back in late 30s was seen by Hitler as a weakness of those countries. So similarly, if something to learn from history, this is again, these Abrahamic Accords can be, we can resonate them with the idea that this was an attempt by the Muslim Arab nations to have some kind of coexistence in the region, but that is being seen by Israel as a weakness of the Arab countries. This is the most unfortunate aspect of this entire episode, and this is why this is an eye-opening event for the Muslim countries to be able to realize that they have to look out for their own selves. They cannot rely upon any other country, and even so, if they have to look for external actors, it has to be someone else apart from the US. Look for towards China, for example. China has already played a key role in rapprochement between the Iranians and the Saudis, by the way, and not so long ago.
Fair enough. Let me go to Dr. Salma. Dr. Salma, of course, international law has its limitations. I want to acknowledge that at the outset. But that said, do you think that legal mechanisms still exist to classify Israel's systemic targeting of civilians, journalists, children, women, workers as war crimes, and if the Muslim nations can play a role in activating those channels, where of course, and whether we have seen some reaction come from, for example, the European countries. Do you think that can have a broader impact then?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think there's a need for that. First, one thing I would like to mention here is that even if there is any attempt for peace and the US ends up sanctioning Israel and admonishing them, and Israel stops from further aggression, the level of destruction that Israel has wreaked on Gaza and in Palestine is so unprecedented that there is no going back from there. There is not going to be any rebuilding of those destroyed lives as well as the homeland. Israel is, each time Israel ends up doing what it has been doing, or let's say there's a pause of a peace process, it never goes in reverse. Nothing is reclaimed by the Palestinians. They end up losing more space, more land, more territory. They become more displaced. More people are lost. So this thing has to be clarified, that a peace process, however flimsy it may be, is not really going to redress the grievances as well as the losses Palestinians have faced for the last 2 years at minimum, which this offensive that has continued for the last 2 years. As for the point that you have raised about international law, absolutely. And I think the Muslim countries should be held responsible for not doing the needful task so far. Now that Qatar has come under attack, they have suddenly woken up to the fact that they could be next and anything could happen to them as well. And the type of
I'm going to interject. When we talk about sanctions, for example, or oil embargoes, or diplomatic isolation, those are all, in your opinion, viable options, or you think that these are flimsy at best, and perhaps they will not have the results that everyone wants?
sanction is very important to hurt Israel. And the point that has been raised previously, as Ahmed has also pointed out, that embargoing their economic products, having a complete sanction on Israel is absolutely going to hurt Israel. And that is also going to bring the US on a negotiating table to try and broker a genuine peace. How long the peace will last, that entirely depends. But what is very important is that these things need to be done. And at par and at parallel, there is a need for lawfaring, a need that the Muslim countries should have carried out much earlier. You see, in the earlier months of the Gaza offensive, it were the African countries which had actually called this a genocide and kind of sensitized the UN as well as ICJ and various other international agencies about what is happening in Palestine. None of the Muslim countries did that. None of the Arab neighbors of Palestine did what was required of them. And I think it's little too late, too little and too late, but even now they need to do that. And they now need to actually get on a very strong diplomatic and economic offensive.
Fair enough. Do you see, we talk about, Ahmed, we talk about, of course, the role that the Islamic countries can play together. But in terms of, broadly, as far as the reactions that have come from the other parts of the world, how do you look at them and how do you categorize, the alarm that should have come from elsewhere in the world also? Like I said, if we look at the European countries, there has been some thawing there, if we compare it from perhaps a year ago. So how do you look at that? Do you think that can have a trickle effect? Do you think that can, the world maybe, one has to say watching this tyranny and not reacting, but perhaps bit by bit there is some change overall in the brutality that is being witnessed?
Yeah, definitely. There has been, like you said, some thawing in the Western capitals. We've seen, more than 20 countries of the European Union coming and condemning and saying that there is starvation happening in Gaza, there is genocide happening, and it needs to be stopped. We've seen all that. We've even seen countries like France, UK, Australia announcing that they are willing to recognize Palestine as a state in this year's UN General Assembly session. But having said that, what effect has that had on Israel's actions? Has its actions toned down? I don't think so. I think they've even gone more bolder. They've even criticized those countries who have said they're willing to, recognize Palestine by saying that you're rewarding terrorism. In fact, in his latest statement, which I came across, Netanyahu has been unapologetic about his action. He said that we will do it again, as long as, if countries around the world, according to his definition, harbor terrorism. In fact, he is himself, carrying out state terrorism. So in that context, who will, take some kind of initiative in that way?
What about Israel's internal situation?
The internal situation, there was a news recently. He came to the court, and then once again, as usual, there was an envelope handed over to him in the name of national security, and he had to go back to the office. So this is something that is happening. He is avoiding his corruption cases. There is domestic pressure, by the way, and there have been reports, by the way, if you recall the events in Israel prior to the October 7, Israel was actually on the brink of internal strife. There was a lot of protest happening. So this entire genocidal foreign policy that has been carried out in the last couple of years has been in many ways to distract the local public away from the deficiencies of the Netanyahu government. But for his own survival,
but he's
this has to
wreaking havoc
continue.
on the world, nevertheless.
Sorry?
He's wreaking havoc on the world.
Exactly.
Nevertheless.
Yes, exactly. On behalf of his own political survival. So one thing that could, happen is somehow if there is a removal of the government right now, which is being headed by Netanyahu, could have some kind of respite for the region. But as long as he is in power, such policies will continue. And like I said, even whatever thawing you talked about has further emboldened Israel's position in terms of what they want to achieve. They've sort of rebranded those statements as saying that you rewarded terrorism, and it has enabled them to continue to go on that path, which is again, this won't stop, this madness won't stop until and unless there is a concrete step. For example, UAE has an embassy in Tel Aviv.
Yes.
They also host the Israeli embassy in Abu Dhabi. Why not expel their ambassador? Or likewise, Turkey could do that.
So
why
you're
hasn't
saying
that
that
happened?
those diplomatic, the diplomatic isolation is perhaps just that one step, the start
Yeah,
that
exactly.
has to happen.
Something has to happen. Because otherwise this will continue, and I'm just surprised that it hasn't happened so far.
Let me include Dr. Salma in this also. Dr. Salma, we're talking about this, and I think Ahmed has pointed out very aptly that there needs to be at least that start, and which is, the bare minimum in this case, the way that we are looking at Israel. But foreign policy shifts, as far as the OIC countries are concerned, as far as the OIC member states are concerned, to move beyond condemnation. What kind of foreign policy shifts do you see that perhaps will have to be and are going to be integral for there to be some kind of a credible action against what's happened?
You see, there are two things that we need to look into. When we have the Muslim countries meeting in Qatar, are they meeting primarily to condemn the strike on Qatar, or are they also meeting to condemn what is happening in Palestine? They will do that, definitely, because both of these things are linked up. Yet the fact is that the thrust of this would be more on the Qatari offensive, that what has happened in Qatar is condemnable and the war is expanding horizontally as well as vertically. Did they really do anything when the Iran-Israeli war was taking place? So this is kind of isolated actions that keep happening, and Israel keeps on nudging its actions and keeps on seeing how much more space it has to exploit. So one diplomatic initiative that these countries can do, of course, is to collectively move the United Nations and other bodies in declaring this as a genocide, what is happening in Palestine. Also trying to end the blockade of humanitarian assistance and aid that is happening in Palestine and Gaza. And they should be on the forefront of doing that. Thirdly, what they need to do is they need to sever very simply, they need to just sever their diplomatic contacts with Israel for the time being. They need to put them on hold. They need to bar airspace on Israel. They need to do several actions, and all of these are actions which are non-violent, absolutely doable, and in the right frame of international law, as well as how these things should be done. And of course, that should be backed by the economic sanctions and the type of economic offensive these countries can come up with. And even if they do a token collective action, both on the diplomatic as well as economic front, let's say for a month even, the type of damage it is going to do to Israel is going to be unprecedented. And I think the Muslim countries need to understand how much power they hold collectively to actually turn the tables. But my fear, unfortunately, is that
unfortunately, that's all the time that we have. Thank you so much for being with us, Ahmed, Hassan, Awan. Thank you for joining us today. Dr. Salma Malik, thank you for being with us. Of course, it is time for the Islamic OIC member states to come together for collective action against Israel and the way that, of course, they continue to cross red lines and their brutality, of course, that continues to increase even as we speak. And whether we talk about oil embargoes or we we talk about diplomatic isolation, or we talk about sanctions, or perhaps all these options, it is now time for there to be strong reaction to what has transpired. Let's hope that we can see that, and let's hope that we can see the world react the way they should to the kind of tyranny that is happening at the hand of Israel alone. Thank you so much for joining us today on Perspective.